She took my bridesmaid dress and showed up as the bride. Some betrayals cut so deep they reshape your understanding of human nature itself. What you're about to hear defies belief. Yet every word is true. The audacity, the calculated cruelty, the sheer brass neck of it all still leaves me breathless 3 years later. This isn't just a story about a wedding gone wrong. It's about discovering that someone you trusted with your deepest secrets was capable of orchestrating the most spectacular act of sabotage I've ever witnessed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me introduce myself properly. My name is Beatrice Whitmore, and I suppose I should start by saying that I've always been the sensible one. The reliable friend who remembers birthdays, the one who keeps spare tissues in her handbag, the type who color coordinates her wardrobe and actually enjoys doing her taxes. Boring, some might say, but I prefer dependable. At 28, I had my life mapped out with military precision. Established career in marketing, cozy flat in Clapham, and most importantly, my wedding to James scheduled for the 15th of June 2024. I met James 3 years earlier at a friend's dinner party, where he'd spent the entire evening making everyone laugh with his impressions of their mutual colleagues. He was charming in that effortless way that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room when he spoke to you. Dark hair that always looked slightly tousled, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and a laugh that was genuinely infectious. He proposed on a rainy Tuesday evening in our kitchen while I was making shepherd's pie, getting down on one knee right there on the linoleum and presenting me with his grandmother's engagement ring. "Beatrice Whitmore," he'd said, his voice trembling slightly. "Will you marry me and promise to make your shepherd's pie for the rest of our lives?" I said yes before he'd even finished the question. Planning our wedding became my passion project. I'd dreamed of this day since I was 7 years old, meticulously planning every detail from the ivory roses in my bouquet to the vintage lace trim on my dress. The venue was a gorgeous country manor in the Cotswolds, complete with rolling hills and a centuries-old chapel. The guest list had been whittled down to 60 of our closest friends and family. Even the weather forecast looked promising, partly cloudy with a high of 22 degrees. Everything was perfect, absolutely perfect, which is probably why I should have known something would go spectacularly wrong. The first sign of trouble came 6 weeks before the wedding when my maid of honor, Imogen Hartwell, began acting strangely. Imogen and I had been friends since university, where we'd bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared addiction to terrible reality television. She was the spontaneous one to my cautious, the extrovert to my introvert, the friend who convinced me to dye my hair blonde in second year and who held my hair back when I was sick after too many cocktails at graduation. But suddenly, Imogen seemed distant. She'd cancel our planning sessions at the last minute, claiming work emergencies or family obligations. When we did meet, she seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone and giving me half-hearted responses to important decisions about flowers and seating arrangements. "Are you all right?" I asked her one afternoon over coffee, watching as she scrolled through Instagram instead of helping me choose between 2 remarkably similar shades of blush pink for the table linens. "Fine, just busy," she replied without looking up. "Work's mental right now." I knew Imogen worked in PR for a boutique firm in Shoreditch, and it was a demanding job, but she'd never been so dismissive about my wedding before. In fact, she'd been almost more excited than I was when James proposed, immediately launching into plans for the hen-do and insisting we go dress shopping the very next weekend. The second sign came 4 weeks before the wedding when she missed my final dress fitting altogether. I'd specifically requested her presence because I needed her opinion on whether to go with the cathedral veil or the fingertip length. When she didn't show, I rang her mobile 6 times before she finally answered. "Oh God, B, I'm so sorry," she said, and I could hear traffic in the background. "I completely forgot. Got called into an emergency meeting with a client." "It's fine," I lied, though it really wasn't. This was my wedding dress, the dress I'd been dreaming about since I was a child. I wanted my best friend there to share the moment when I saw myself as a bride for the first time. The seamstress, Mrs. Chen, was lovely about it and even offered to take photos so I could show Imogen later, but it wasn't the same. I stood there in my ivory silk gown with its hand-beaded bodice and flowing train, feeling beautiful but also oddly alone. The third and most unsettling sign came 2 weeks before the wedding during my hen party. Imogen had organized the entire weekend in Bath, booking us into a gorgeous Georgian hotel and planning a full itinerary of spa treatments, afternoon tea, and a night out on the town. It should have been perfect, and for the most part it was. My other bridesmaids, James's sister Philippa and my cousin Tabitha, were absolutely lovely, and we had wonderful conversations over champagne and cucumber sandwiches. But Imogen kept steering the conversation toward my relationship with James in ways that felt increasingly uncomfortable. "Are you absolutely certain he's the one?" she asked during our couple's massage, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. "I mean, you've only been together 3 years. That's not very long, is it?" "It feels like a lifetime," I replied, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "In the best possible way." "But don't you wonder what else is out there?" she pressed. "You're only 28, B. You could travel, focus on your career, date other people. Marriage is so final." I turned to look at her properly, frowning. "Imogen, what's gotten into you? You were the one who said James was perfect for me. You said you'd never seen me happier." He shrugged, looking away. "I just want to make sure you're not settling, that's all." The comment stung more than I cared to admit. Settling. James was kind, funny, successful, and absolutely devoted to me. He brought me tea in bed every morning, remembered to pick up my dry cleaning without being asked, and had already started talking about what we'd name our children someday. If that was settling, then I was perfectly content to settle. But Imogen's words planted a seed of doubt that niggled at me for the rest of the weekend. Why was she suddenly questioning my relationship? And why did she seem so invested in the idea that I might be making a mistake? The final week before the wedding passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and mounting anxiety. James was wonderfully supportive, handling the increasingly hysterical calls from his mother about dietary requirements and making sure our honeymoon luggage was properly sorted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Imogen. She'd been practically MIA during the final week, claiming she was swamped with work and couldn't help with any of the last-minute tasks. When I asked her to pick up the bridesmaid dresses from the seamstress, she said she'd handle it but then never confirmed that she'd actually collected them. I ended up having to call the shop myself, only to discover that Imogen had indeed picked them up 3 days earlier. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked when I finally reached her on her mobile. "Sorry, completely slipped my mind," she said, her voice distracted. "I've been so scattered lately." The night before the wedding, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, where I was staying according to tradition. James was at his best man's house across town, and the bridesmaids were supposedly all tucked up in their rooms at the manor house where the ceremony would take place. I should have been excited, but instead I felt unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Imogen. "Can't sleep either? Wedding nerves are the worst. See you tomorrow, beautiful bride. It's going to be the most unforgettable day of your life, XXX." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to put my finger on what bothered me about it. The tone seemed off somehow. Too bright, too enthusiastic, especially considering how distant she'd been lately. And there was something about the phrase, "most unforgettable day," that felt less like a blessing and more like a warning. But I was probably just being paranoid. Wedding nerves, as she'd said. I turned off the light and tried to get some sleep, telling myself that tomorrow everything would be perfect. I couldn't have been more wrong. "I suppose you're expecting me to defend myself, to explain how things spiraled so far out of control. But the truth is, I'm not sure I can. Looking back, I'm not even certain I recognize the person I became in those final weeks before Beatrice's wedding. It's like watching footage of yourself sleepwalking through a nightmare, completely unable to comprehend your own actions. But let me start from the beginning, because the seeds of this disaster were planted long before that June morning when I walked into St. Bartholomew's Chapel wearing Beatrice's life like an ill-fitting costume. My name is Imogen Hartwell, and I've been in love with James Morrison since the moment Beatrice introduced us at that dinner party 3 years ago. I know how that sounds. Like a tired cliché from a romantic comedy where the best friend realizes too late that she's been blind to her own feelings. But clichés become clichés because they happen often enough to feel universal. And the truth is that I fell for James so hard and so instantly that I spent the next 3 years perfecting the art of pretending I didn't. I was the one who encouraged Beatrice to give him her number. I was the one who helped her pick out the perfect outfit for their first proper date. I was the one who listened to her gush about how wonderful he was, nodding and smiling and making all the right supportive noises while my heart quietly shattered into smaller and smaller pieces. You have to understand, I never meant for it to happen. Beatrice had always been the one who got the great guys. She had this way about her, this genuine sweetness that drew people in like moths to a flame. She was the girl who remembered your birthday, who brought soup when you were ill, who never had a bad word to say about anyone. She deserved happiness, and I knew that. I truly did. Oh, James. God, James was everything I'd ever wanted in a man. He was brilliant in that effortless way that made you feel smarter just by being around him. He had this laugh that started low in his chest and bubbled up until it filled an entire room. He could make anyone feel like the most interesting person at a party, and he had this habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking deeply about something that made my stomach flip every time I saw it. More than that, though, we just clicked. We had the same sense of humor, the same taste in films, the same tendency to overthink everything until we'd analyzed it to death. When the three of us hung out together, James and I would fall into these long conversations about books or politics or whatever documentary he'd watched the night before, and I'd catch myself thinking, this is what it would be like. This is what we'd be like together. But he was with Beatrice. Sweet, perfect, deserving Beatrice who loved him completely and whom he adored in return. So I buried my feelings so deep that I almost convinced myself they didn't exist. I dated other people, had relationships that lasted anywhere from a few weeks to several months, always ending things when they got too serious because no one ever measured up to the impossible standard James had set. When he proposed to Beatrice, I cried for 3 hours in my bathroom before calling her to squeal about how excited I was. I even helped her pick out wedding magazines, flipping through pages of white dresses and flower arrangements while imagining what it would be like if it were my wedding we were planning. The breaking point came 8 weeks before the wedding when Beatrice asked me to help her choose between 2 potential honeymoon destinations. She'd narrowed it down to the Maldives and Santorini, and she wanted my opinion on which would be more romantic. James prefers the Maldives, she said, spreading brochures across my kitchen table. But I keep gravitating towards Santorini. All those white buildings and blue water. It looks like something from a fairy tale. She was glowing as she talked about it, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured at the photos. She looked so happy, so utterly content with her choices, and suddenly I felt like I was suffocating. I think you should go with what James wants, I heard myself saying. It's his honeymoon too. She looked at me strangely. That's not like you, Emmy. You're usually telling me to follow my heart and all that. And that's when it hit me. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending to be happy about a wedding that felt like my own personal funeral. I couldn't keep being the supportive best friend while watching the man I loved promise his life to someone else. But instead of talking to someone, instead of distancing myself or seeking therapy or doing any of the healthy things a rational person might do, I began to spiral. Started small. I'd skip wedding planning sessions, claiming work commitments that were only half true. I'd forget to return calls about dress fittings or flower arrangements. I told myself I was protecting my own sanity, creating some distance so I could get through the actual wedding day without breaking down completely. But the distance only made things worse. The less involved I was in the wedding planning, the more I felt like an outsider looking in at the life I wanted for myself. Every cancelled coffee date, every missed planning session, every excuse I made just highlighted how much I didn't belong in Beatrice's happy story. The real turning point came 6 weeks before the wedding when I had drinks with a colleague who was going through a messy divorce. She'd had too much wine and was being particularly vicious about her soon-to-be ex-husband. Men are all the same, she slurred, waving her glass dangerously. They think they want the good girl, the wife material, the one who'll make their mothers happy. But they're always looking for something more exciting on the side. Mark my words, Imogen. Your friend's perfect fiancé will be having an affair within 5 years. "That's not true," I protested, but her words lodged themselves in my brain like splinters. What if she was right? What if James was only marrying Beatrice because she was safe, predictable, the obvious choice? What if, deep down, he wanted something more? Someone more exciting, more challenging, more like me? I know how delusional that sounds now, but at the time it felt like a revelation. Maybe I'd been approaching this all wrong. Maybe instead of stepping aside and letting love take its course, I should be fighting for what I wanted. Maybe James needed to see that there were other options, that he didn't have to settle for the first nice girl who came along. The plan, such as it was, began forming during Beatrice's hen weekend in Bath. I kept probing her about her relationship, trying to find cracks I could widen, seeds of doubt I could plant. But she was so bloody happy, so completely secure in James's love for her, that nothing I said seemed to land. "Don't you ever wonder what else is out there?" I asked during one of our spa treatments, watching her face carefully for any sign of uncertainty. "Not for a second," she replied without hesitation. "James is my person, Immy. I've never been surer of anything in my life." Her certainty was infuriating. How could she be so complacent? How could she take for granted what I would have given anything to have? That's when the really crazy ideas started forming. What if I could show James what he was missing? What if I could demonstrate that Beatrice wasn't the only option, that there was someone right in front of him who understood him better, who could make him happier? I began researching wedding sabotage online, reading forums and articles about disrupted ceremonies. Most of it was petty stuff. Ex-girlfriends standing up during the speak now or forever hold your peace part, drunk relatives making scenes during the reception. But one story stuck with me. A woman whose maid of honor had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to prove the groom's loyalty by hiring someone to seduce him at his bachelor party. The woman had justified her actions by claiming she was protecting her friend from making a mistake. If the groom was truly committed, he'd resist temptation and prove he was worthy. If not, better to find out before the wedding than after. Reading that story was like looking into a funhouse mirror. I could see the twisted logic, the way she'd convinced herself that her betrayal was actually an act of love. And God help me, I started wondering if I could do something similar. Not hire someone to seduce James, obviously. But what if I could create a situation that would force him to confront his true feelings? What if I could make him see me, really see me, as something other than Beatrice's best friend? The final piece of the puzzle fell into place the week before the wedding when I picked up the bridesmaid dresses from the seamstress. I'd been dreading this moment, knowing that seeing myself in the soft pink silk would only remind me that I'd be watching from the sidelines as someone else lived my dream. But when I got home and tried on my dress, something strange happened. The color was perfect with my complexion, and the cut was incredibly flattering. I looked beautiful. Not just pretty or nice, but genuinely beautiful in a way that took my breath away. And suddenly, standing there in my bedroom mirror, I had the most insane thought. What if I didn't have to be the bridesmaid? What if I could be the bride? I know how mad that sounds. But in that moment, looking at myself in that dress, I could almost pretend it was my wedding dress, my special day, my happily ever after. The fantasy was so vivid, so intoxicating that I lost myself in it completely. What if I showed up at the church in white instead of pink? What if I walked down that aisle and stood where Beatrice was supposed to stand? What would James do? What would he say? Would he be angry, confused? Or would he look at me, really look at me, and realize that I was the one he was supposed to marry all along? I spent the entire week before the wedding in a sort of manic haze, convincing myself that this wasn't betrayal but destiny. That I wasn't destroying my best friend's happiness but saving her from a marriage that was never meant to be. That James would see me in that white dress and finally understand what had been right in front of him all along. I bought the dress on the Wednesday before the wedding, a simple but stunning white silk number that was remarkably similar to Beatrice's, just different enough that I told myself it was its own thing entirely. I had it altered in 2 days, spending a fortune on rush fees that left my credit card smoking. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. I kept imagining different scenarios. James's face when he saw me, the gasps from the congregation, the moment when everything would finally make sense. In every version I played out in my head, it ended with James choosing me. With Beatrice understanding that this was for the best. With everyone realizing that this was how things were always supposed to be. I texted Beatrice that night, some nonsense about wedding nerves and unforgettable days, because I needed to say something. I needed to feel connected to her one last time before I destroyed everything. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5 a.m. with my heart pounding. For about 30 seconds, lying there in the pre-dawn darkness, I remembered who I was supposed to be. I remembered that I was Imogen, Beatrice's best friend, her maid of honor, the person who was supposed to help her get ready for the happiest day of her life. But then I saw the white dress hanging on my wardrobe door, ethereal and beautiful in the early morning light, and the fantasy took over again. This was my chance. This was my moment. This was my one opportunity to stop being the supporting character in someone else's love story and become the heroine of my own. So I got dressed, did my hair and makeup with extra care, and drove to the church where I would commit the most spectacular act of betrayal in the history of friendship. And I felt, God help me, absolutely radiant. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I had no idea. None whatsoever. When I woke up on the morning of my wedding day, I was the happiest man alive. I was about to marry the woman I adored, surrounded by friends and family who loved us both. It was everything I'd dreamed of since the day I decided Beatrice was the person I wanted to spend my life with. My name is James Morrison, and I met Beatrice 3 years ago at what I can only describe as the most boring dinner party in human history. My mate Trevor had invited me to his flat for what he promised would be a sophisticated evening of conversation and cuisine, which translated to leftover Chinese takeaway and arguing about whether Die Hard is a Christmas film. I was ready to make my excuses and leave when this woman walked in carrying a bottle of wine and a homemade lemon drizzle cake. She had warm brown eyes that crinkled slightly when she smiled, shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light beautifully, and this way of listening to people that made them feel like they were the only person in the room. When Trevor introduced her as Beatrice, she laughed and said, "Like the Shakespeare character, but hopefully with better judgment about men." I was completely done for. We ended up talking until nearly 2 in the morning about everything from travel destinations we'd never afford to whether aliens would prefer tea or coffee if they visited Earth. She had this wonderfully dry sense of humor that caught me off guard, and when she laughed at my admittedly terrible impressions of Trevor's other guests, I felt like I'd won the lottery. When I asked for her number at the end of the night, she hesitated for just a moment before saying, "I should probably mention that I'm quite boring. I do crosswords for fun and I alphabetize my bookshelf." "Perfect," I told her. "I reorganize my sock drawer when I'm stressed, so we're clearly meant to be." 3 years later, I still felt that same flutter in my stomach when she smiled at me over her morning coffee. She was everything I'd never known I wanted. Kind without being naive, funny without being cruel, ambitious without being ruthless. She made me want to be the best version of myself, and somehow, miraculously, she seemed to feel the same way about me. The proposal had been as unromantic as possible by conventional standards, but it was perfectly us. We were in our kitchen on a Tuesday evening. She was making her famous shepherd's pie, famous among our friends for being inexplicably delicious despite containing what appeared to be the most random collection of vegetables, and I was pretending to help while actually just watching her move around our tiny kitchen like she owned the place. "Beatrice," I said, my voice coming out more nervous than I'd intended. "If you're about to tell me I've oversalted the potatoes again, I already know," she replied without looking up from the stove. "No, God, this is harder than I thought it would be." She turned around then, probably expecting me to confess to some minor domestic disaster, and found me on one knee holding my grandmother's engagement ring. The look on her face, surprise melting into joy melting into tears, was worth every ounce of terror I'd felt about proposing. "James Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you proposing to me while I'm cooking?" "I'm proposing to you because you're cooking," I corrected. "Because you make shepherd's pie on Tuesday nights, and because you sing to the radio when you think I'm not listening, and because you leave little notes in my lunch when I have important meetings. I'm proposing because I love you exactly as you are, and I want to spend the rest of my life discovering all the things I don't know about you yet." She said yes before I finished speaking, which was probably for the best because I was starting to ramble. We ate shepherd's pie off the good china that night and called our parents to share the news, and I fell asleep thinking that I was the luckiest man alive. The wedding planning had been surprisingly enjoyable, largely because Beatrice approached it with the same methodical enthusiasm she brought to everything else. She had color-coded spreadsheets and backup plans for the backup plans, but she also had this way of getting genuinely excited about small details that made the whole process feel magical rather than stressful. "Look at this," she'd say, showing me fabric swatches or flower arrangements or menu options. "Isn't it perfect?" And it always was, because she had this gift for seeing beauty in everything and making everyone around her see it too. The only thing that worried me, if I'm being honest, was Imogen. Beatrice's best friend had always been lovely to me, but lately she seemed off, distant, distracted, sometimes almost hostile in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. During conversations, she'd ask pointed questions about our relationship that felt less like friendly curiosity and more like cross-examination. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she'd ask me at my bachelor party, cornering me by the bar while the other lads were arguing about cricket. "Marriage is a big step. You're sure you're not having any second thoughts?" "None whatsoever," I'd replied, which was the truth. "I've never been surer of anything in my life." She'd given me this look, half disappointed, half something else I couldn't identify, before nodding and walking away. I mentioned it to Beatrice once, gently, but she'd just shrugged it off. "Imogen's always been protective of me," she'd said. "She's probably just making sure you're worthy of her best friend." I'd accepted that explanation because it was easier than digging deeper, but the truth was that Imogen's behavior had been bothering me for weeks. There was something in her eyes when she looked at me that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't have articulated exactly what it was. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at my best man's house feeling like Christmas morning and my birthday rolled into one. In a few hours, I'd be married to the most wonderful woman in the world. We'd have our first dance to At Last by Etta James, cut a cake that Beatrice had agonized over for weeks, and then jet off to Santorini for 2 weeks of sun, ouzo and married life. My best man, Charlie, made me a proper breakfast and kept me distracted with stories about his latest dating disasters while I got ready. The morning flew by in a blur of nervous excitement, last-minute checks, and increasingly terrible jokes from Charlie about marriage being the end of life as you know it. "Ignore him," said my brother David, who'd arrived early to help with final preparations. "He's just jealous that you found someone willing to put up with you permanently." We arrived at St. Bartholomew's Chapel 45 minutes early, because I'm nothing if not punctual when it comes to the important things. The venue was everything Beatrice had dreamed of, a 14th-century stone chapel surrounded by rolling green hills, with stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. The flowers were perfect, white roses and baby's breath, just as she'd wanted, and the altar had been decorated with trailing ivy and fairy lights that would look magical in the photographs. Everything was exactly as we'd planned, exactly as she'd envisioned. I took my place at the front of the chapel, Charlie beside me, trying to calm the butterflies in my stomach by focusing on the familiar faces filling the pews. Beatrice's parents, looking proud and slightly tearful in the front row. My colleagues from work, several of whom had traveled from London for the occasion. University friends who'd known us as a couple almost from the beginning. The organist began playing the processional music, and my heart started racing with anticipation. In just a few moments, I'd see Beatrice in her wedding dress for the first time. She'd been so secretive about it, refusing to give me even the smallest hint about what it looked like. "You'll just have to wait and see," she teased whenever I asked. "But I promise you'll love it." The chapel doors opened, and the bridesmaids began their procession down the aisle. First came Philippa, my sister, looking lovely in the soft pink dress Beatrice had chosen. Then Tabitha, Beatrice's cousin, beaming as she made her way toward the altar. Then, I'm not sure I have words for what happened next. The chapel doors opened wider, and someone in white began walking down the aisle. For a split second, my brain tried to process what I was seeing as normal, Of course someone in white was walking down the aisle. It was Beatrice, my bride, the woman I was about to marry. But it wasn't Beatrice. It was Imogen. She was wearing a white dress that was remarkably similar to the one Beatrice had described to me. Her dark hair styled in an elaborate updo, carrying a bouquet of white roses. She was walking slowly, purposefully, with a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The chapel went completely silent. Not the reverent silence of a wedding ceremony, but the shocked, horrified silence of a room full of people trying to process something that couldn't possibly be happening. I stood there, frozen, as Imogen continued her march down the aisle. She was looking directly at me, her eyes bright with something that might have been triumph or madness or both. When she reached the altar, she took her place beside me as if she belonged there. "Hello, James," she said softly, as if we were meeting for coffee rather than standing in front of 60 wedding guests while she committed the most spectacular act of sabotage I'd ever witnessed. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what the hell she thought she was doing, but no words came out. I was genuinely speechless, my brain unable to process the sheer audacity of what was happening. The vicar, bless him, looked as confused as everyone else. He kept glancing between Imogen and the chapel doors, clearly waiting for the actual bride to appear and explain what was going on. I finally managed to croak out. "Imogen, what are you doing?" She smiled wider, reaching for my hand. "I'm marrying you, of course. I'm the bride you're supposed to be with, James. I've always been the bride." And that's when the real chaos began. I arrived at the chapel 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, just as we'd rehearsed. My father was driving, and we'd barely spoken during the 15-minute journey from the manor house where I'd gotten ready. Not because we were upset with each other, but because we were both too emotional for words. This was the moment we'd both been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. His little girl's wedding day. I felt like a princess in my dress. The ivory silk moved like water around me, and the hand-beaded bodice caught the afternoon light beautifully. My hair was styled in a low chignon with small white flowers tucked throughout, and my grandmother's pearl earrings completed the look. I'd never felt more beautiful in my life. "Ready, love?" my father asked as we pulled up to the chapel. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my skirt one final time. More than ready. The plan was simple. I'd wait in the bridal suite, a small room at the back of the chapel, while the guests finished arriving and the ceremony began. The bridesmaids would process first, then the music would change, and I'd make my grand entrance to marry the love of my life. But when we arrived at the chapel, something was obviously wrong. Instead of the gentle murmur of conversation you'd expect from a gathering congregation, there was complete silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy and ominous. Mrs. Patterson, the wedding coordinator, met us at the side entrance looking flustered and pale. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, addressing my mother who'd arrived separately with my aunt. "We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" Mum asked, immediately going into crisis mode. Mrs. Patterson glanced at me nervously, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." But I was having none of it. This was my wedding day, and if there was a problem, I wanted to know about it immediately. "Just tell me what's wrong," I said firmly. Mrs. Patterson took a deep breath. "There's someone. There's a woman in the chapel wearing a wedding dress. She's standing at the altar with the groom." For a moment, the words didn't compute. I heard them, but they didn't make sense. Someone in a wedding dress. Standing with James. That was impossible. I was the one in the wedding dress. I was the one who was supposed to be standing with James. "I'm sorry, what?" I said, certain I'd misheard. "Your maid of honor," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Imogen. She's at the altar in a white dress." The world tilted sideways. I actually reached out to grab my father's arm to steady myself, because I was genuinely afraid I might fall over. "That's impossible," I said. "Imogen is supposed to be processing with the other bridesmaids. She's wearing a pink dress." Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "I'm afraid she's not, dear. She's wearing white, and she's positioned herself as if she were the bride. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she was telling me. Then, without saying another word, I pushed past her and headed for the chapel doors. "Beatrice, wait." My mother called after me, but I was already moving. I had to see this for myself. I had to understand what was happening because surely there was some reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was some sort of surprise that had gone horribly wrong. I pushed through the chapel doors and saw her immediately. Imogen, my best friend since university, my maid of honor, the person I'd trusted with every detail of my wedding, standing at my altar in a white dress that could have been my twin sister to my own. She was holding James's hand. The sight hit me like a physical blow. Every guest in the chapel had turned to stare at me, the actual bride, as I stood frozen in the doorway in my wedding dress, creating the most surreal tableau imaginable. 2 brides, 1 groom, and 60 horrified witnesses. James looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting between Imogen and me as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening either. "Beatrice," Imogen said, turning to face me with a smile that was equal parts triumphant and completely unhinged. "You're late to your own wedding. But don't worry, I've got this handled." That's when something inside me snapped. All the weeks of her strange behavior, the cancelled meetings, the pointed questions about my relationship, it all suddenly made perfect, horrible sense. This wasn't a joke or a misunderstanding. This was calculated, premeditated betrayal on a scale I couldn't have imagined possible. "Get away from my fiancé," I said, my voice carrying across the silent chapel with crystal clarity. "Actually," Imogen replied, her grip tightening on James's hand, "I think you'll find he's reconsidering his options. Aren't you, James?" James jerked his hand away from hers as if she'd burned him. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he said, turning to face our guests. "Everyone, I'm sorry, but we need to clear the chapel. This woman is having some sort of breakdown." But I wasn't done. 3 years of friendship, 3 months of wedding planning, 3 weeks of her bizarre behavior. It all crystallized into pure fury. "You wore my bridesmaid dress to the final fitting," I said, my voice steady despite the rage coursing through me. "You picked up all the dresses. You tried on my life like it was a costume." Imogen's facade finally cracked. "Your life," she spat. "Your perfect little life with the perfect man who never even saw me. I've been in love with him since the day you introduced us, Beatrice. I've spent 3 years watching you take for granted what I would have died for." The chapel erupted in shocked murmurs, but I barely heard them. "So you decided to steal my wedding day." "I decided to show him what he was missing," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "I thought if he saw me, really saw me." "He sees you," James interrupted, his voice cold with disgust. "We all see you. And what we see is someone who needs serious help." Security, my father and James's brother David, finally stepped in to escort Imogen out. As they led her away, still in her stolen white dress, she turned back one final time. "This should have been my day," she called out, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "It should have been mine." The chapel fell silent again. 60 guests, 2 families, 1 vicar, and a bride and groom stared at each other in the aftermath of the most spectacular betrayal any of us had ever witnessed. James walked over to me, took my hands, and said the only thing that mattered. "Shall we try this again? Because I'd very much like to marry you today, if you'll have me." I looked at this man who just watched his bride's best friend try to steal our wedding and responded with nothing but love and determination to marry me anyway. "Let's do it properly this time." And we did. 20 minutes later, after the vicar had composed himself and the guests had settled back into their seats, I walked down that aisle again. This time, there was only 1 bride, 1 groom, and the promise of a future built on genuine love rather than delusion. Imogen had been right about one thing. It was the most unforgettable day of my life. Just not in the way she'd intended. 3 years later, James and I are blissfully happy, expecting our first child, and have never spoken to Imogen again. Sometimes the most shocking betrayals reveal exactly who deserves to be in your life, and who absolutely doesn't. The woman who tried to steal my wedding day taught me that some friendships aren't worth saving, but the right love is worth everything.